Hello, everyone. We're going to start now. I'm Sherry Goodman, Director of Education and Academic Relations here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our afternoon program, which is designed to complement the new iteration, the summer iteration of the exhibition titled Way Bay. All right? So the idea behind this program, and also what lay behind the two previous programs in the spring, the idea was to invite several, not a lot, but 4 or 5 wonderful and distinctive Bay Area individuals to each address a wonderful and distinctive artist featured in the Way Bay exhibition, right? And each presenter will be providing information about the life and art of an individual artist, and this is by way of enriching or compensating for the fact that the exhibition itself, which is designed to be very sort of associative and poetic, does not aim to provide, okay? So it's sort of a counter dimension. So I do hope that the rather idiosyncratically disparate quality of the program, in the best sense, provides or suggests a sense of the kind of discovery experience that you will have of the exhibition itself. Okay? So Way Bay has been organized by our director and chief curator, Larry Rinder, our film curator, Kathy Garretts, our guest programmer, artist David Wilson, together with John Shibata, assistant film archivist, and Matt Coleman, who is our curatorial assistant. And now I would like to thank the donors to the exhibition who have made it possible. The exhibition is thanks to lead support from Nyan McAvoy and Leslie Berryman, with additional funding from Alexandra Bowes and Stephen Williamson, Rena Branston, Gertrude Park, Janie and Jeff Green, the J. DeFeo Foundation, and a number of other generous donors. Now I'm going to be introducing each of the 5 presenters in the order that they'll be speaking. Okay? So Tom Demaria will be talking about artist Judith Scott. Tom, since 2002, has been served as director of Creative Growth Art Center in Oakland, with vision and brio, to summarize. He has brought to international attention, brought fully into the contemporary art world artists with disabilities, thanks to creating and encouraging many partnerships with museums and galleries and international design firms. And I have to mention that prior to his current position, Tom was our Director of Marketing and Development, and I still remember the enormous energy that he brought to that role, sometimes surprising me by being here, maybe it was all the time for all I know, at 7 a.m. in the morning. Maybe I remember that, maybe it was 7:30. Anyhow, and then next is going to be Sandra Phillips, who will be discussing photographer Lew Thomas. So Sandra, who's very well known in the Bay Area, is curator of photography emerita at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where she organized innumerable, wonderful, much acclaimed exhibitions of modern and contemporary photography. And now, lucky us, she is our adjunct senior curator for photography and currently working on an exhibition that opens in March of truly exciting photographs from the Goodman photography collection. Then, Brett Goodroad will be discussing artist Fred Martin. Brett is a Montana-raised, San Francisco-based artist who has described his own work as, quote, mimicking nature. Of course, there is a lot more that could and should be said about his art, which is really wonderful. And you can see for yourself, because one of his beautiful paintings is currently featured in Way Bay, It's titled Bert, On the Mountain, One Line Grown. So I hope you'll get to look at that. So Brett studied with Fred Martin at the San Francisco Art Institute, and I'm happy to tell you that Fred is actually here today with us. I don't know where he's sitting. Good, yes, I told him ahead to please raise his hand, so please raise it again. There's Fred. So, and I don't want to forget to tell you that immediately following the program, Brett will have a number of Fred's paintings, actual artwork, on display at a table right outside of the theater. So I hope you'll take time to look at them. And then we have Terry Cannon, who's come in from Los Angeles, to introduce the work of filmmaker Sara Kathryn Arledge. Right? So since the mid-1970s, Terry has been a pivotal figure in the world of experimental film in the Los Angeles area, which, as we all know, is better known for the creation and celebration of mainstream cinema. In 1975, he founded, and for many years curated, the influential Pasadena Film Forum, which is currently known as the Los Angeles Film Forum. And in 1984, he launched Spiral, a magazine devoted to experimental film. So Terry befriended and led the rediscovery of a number of experimental filmmakers from the earlier generation working in LA, one of whom was Sara Kathryn Arledge, a painter and filmmaker whose films, glass slides, and writings he was instrumental in bringing into our, the BAMPFA collection, for which we are extremely grateful. Thank you, Terry. And our fifth presenter is Keith Wilson, who will be considering the artist, filmmaker, actor, and musician Frank Moore. Keith is a San Francisco-based filmmaker and visual artist who has exhibited at the Sundance Film Festival, South by Southwest, the Berlinale Film Festival, and the National Gallery of Art. Keith is currently producing a documentary and virtual reality project about Frank Moore called Deep Inside the Shaman's Den, which we're very much looking forward to having. Okay, with that, our first presenter, Tom Demaria.
Thank you, Sherry. So nice to be here. Good afternoon to you all. So how does a woman locked in an institution in Ohio for 40 years who is deaf and was born with Down syndrome come to have her work in the exhibition here at Berkeley Art Museum and last year in the Venice Biennale? Well, it's a compelling story, I think, if you want to look at it that way. And the work of Judith Scott and her life actually mirrors, it's a Bay Area story, mirrors the advancement of people with disabilities over the last 40 years that many of us have experienced in our lifetime. The disability rights movement is largely based in Berkeley, so this is a perfect place to talk about the advancement of the ADA and Ed Roberts and the work that was done there. In parallel to that, in the early 1970s, when the state of California suddenly deinstitutionalized an entire population of people with developmental disabilities who used to live in state-run hospitals, artists in Berkeley got together to serve these people, believing that creativity was the path forward to people whose lives had essentially been warehoused and lost, put paint on a table in their own home here in Berkeley and said these people can come here and be artists. That initial idea from Berkeley 44 years later is Creative Growth Art Center in Oakland, California, where we serve 162 artists with developmental disabilities every week. So those are the Bay Area connections. Now, if we look at 1986, this woman in Ohio in the institution, how did she get there? Well, she was born a twin, and she was born deaf and with Down syndrome, and her sister was what we'd call typical. So the two sisters are raised together until age 5 or 6 at home, and then under the advice of the doctor, Judith has to be institutionalized. She has Down syndrome. So the mother asks, well, how do we do that? And the doctor says, well, you just take her out of the bed in the middle of the night when the girls are sleeping and no one will remember in the morning. So this is done, and she's institutionalized for 40 years. Her sister, now living in Berkeley, 40 years later, has an epiphany at a Buddhist retreat. I have a twin sister, and this is what we do. So she goes back to Ohio, has the sister deinstitutionalized, brings her to Berkeley, knows of creative growth, and says perhaps creativity is the path forward. So Judith's arrival at creative growth was not auspicious. She sat in a deinstitutionalized state for essentially 2 years trying to find a path forward, until she began what was kind of an epic path to sculpture making, acquiring, appropriating an art world language, stealing, from a creative growth point of view, anything around her, wrapping, binding, bundling them into these sculptural forms like this. Some people would say this is the two twin sisters reunited. So her process was, until one piece was finished, we never knew what the next one would look like. There was not any verbal communication. So how does she come to make this work, and how do we come to understand what she was doing? For me, there are several influences that we can look at in terms of how she might have arrived at her work. One is the tactile nature of her work. As a fiber artist, and fiber artists describe the soothing, comforting, repetitive nature of working with yarn and fabric as a meditative, relaxing kind of method. And I think that was very soothing to her as a person negotiating her new life. The question of biography always comes up, and to some degree, it's an influence in her work. Living in a place where nothing was private or protected, she took objects that were precious to her, bound them together, kept them safe, sacred. At the end of the day, hiding her sculptures and process under a table, bearing the objects that were important to her so they'd be there the next day. And language is critical to understanding her work. And today I want to talk just for a minute about Judith's process and look at her in the context of being a deaf artist, because that's rarely discussed. And here's Judith making a piece that she's no longer alive. She died in 2005. This is her making a piece in creative growth, and you can see how she started by accumulating objects and not really wrapping them, but weaving them into sculptural forms that conceptual artists responded to immediately, because it was always unknown what actually was in them. So her work is very visual, but it's also tactile, and I think that's part of her identity as a deaf person. And I've always thought of her work as a language, or a language substitute. So her challenge is, how does she tell us the story of her life without language? And if you look at language acquisition, the critical time, because she didn't have language, they didn't know she was deaf. 40 years in the institution, they didn't know she was deaf. They just thought she was profoundly dumb. So they never gave her any language. And if you don't acquire language by a certain age, usually age 3 or 4, that part of your brain atrophies. We know that if we try to acquire a second language later in life, it gets harder and harder. If you've never had it, it becomes impossible. So the critical years for learning language are, ages 2 and 3. And she never had that capacity. So I think she had to find a way to become engaged in language and becoming engaged with the world. Now it's interesting, if you're a hearing person, and you're learning sign language often seems to present words and ideas one on top of each other in these non-narrative bundles, with the total impact of the motion and the sign and the gestures and the words and the verbs are all piled on top of each other to form meaning. And I think in many ways she approached that with her sculpture. Here's another example. So the critical years, the critical months for learning language are 18 to 36 months old for a child, about 2 years. So Judith sat in the Creative Growth Studio for 2 years before she made her sculpture, mostly with her hands on a table. And I think in some ways it's her second life. She's reborn, in her path to language is a 2-year process, and this is the process that she developed. So in many ways, she did the impossible, telling us her life story with her own invented language. And I'll leave you just with a few images of her exhibitions. This was one of the first exhibitions we did of her work in Japan in 2001 at the Shiseido Cosmetic Company has a large contemporary gallery in the Ginza, and we presented her work there. It's always been important for Creative Growth to present our artists' work as contemporary art, not as disability art, but we're very supportive and proud of our artists' achievement and how their disability influences, in the case of Judith Scott and some others, influences their aesthetic. Judith had a solo one-woman show at the Brooklyn Art Museum 3 or 4 years ago at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art. Again, the point of being presented as a contemporary feminist artist of her time, not as a disability artist. And I'll leave you with her installation last summer, the Venice Biennale, 20 sculptures, the first artist with Down syndrome to be presented there, along with her former studio mate at Creative Growth named Dan Miller, the first artist with autism presented in the Venice Biennale, who also has a drawing included in this show. So I'll leave you there, and I'll thank you for your interest.
So I've been asked to talk a little bit about Lew Thomas, a conceptual artist who's actually still alive, living in Petaluma now, but for many years living in the San Francisco Bay Area, actually in San Francisco for a long time. He worked for many years as the director of the bookstore at the Legion of Honor, and he lived out there in the Outer Mission, in the far, I guess you would call it, well, anyway, near the Legion. Lew Thomas was known as a structuralist photographer. He published several monographs. He worked with his friend Sandra Phillips, who is also an important photographer of that period, and who also worked with images and words. And they together helped to found and run Camera Work, which actually still exists. They also worked with La Mamelle, which was an important alternative experimental art group in San Francisco of the 70s, really, 60s and 70s. It's important that he achieved some kind of distinction and expression in Northern California, because I think his work can be best seen as a counterweight to the tradition of photography in Northern California. Northern California has had a very long and very distinguished tradition. It actually started in the 19th century with the gold rush. People came out to Northern California and suddenly discovered that they needed their portraits taken and landscape photographed for mining information for sites. And we've had in Northern California a very impressive tradition for photography. At the turn of the century, it became perhaps more generally known to the outside world. There was a group called the F-64 group, whose main figure was Edward Weston, but who was also, which was also articulated by Ansel Adams. We tend to think of Adams and Weston today as kind of old-fashioned. And by the 60s and 70s, indeed, there were people here in Northern California who also thought they were old-fashioned, and there was some other way of making photography, and that's where our friend Lew Thomas and his group come in. They were trying to present an alternative to abstract, formalist language of photography that had been developed by Weston and his crew. Imogen Cunningham would be another one. So they wanted to support a new attitude towards photography, and they turned to structuralism. And I don't want to talk too much about this, but I'm sure many of you know the work of Alain Robbe-Grillet. The structuralists are mainly a literary group. Lew was very interested in writing and proselytizing this kind of alternative way of seeing photographs. And he talks actually about photography through film. He says, let's see, more than being a merely literary analogy, the progress of film and plot is a progress, and he's talking about film specifically here, the progress is of mythic stature because it is systematically structural, because it represents an ordering of the structure of perceived reality. In the oldest sense of the word, it is a kind of cosmology, but it is also fundamentally rhetorical, for it is the dialectical agent by which the artist enunciates his vision of the world. The pattern beneath the plot is a mythic system, itself a microcosm, allowing us to say that such and such is the way things are, even though they might be elaborated into such diverse and richly literary shapes as Cool Hand Luke, for instance. So then I'm going to just jump to the photography part of it. Of course, to a large degree, one's frame of reference is a cultural matter. One thinks, one perceives, one in fact experiences cognition from within the shifting boundaries of the linguistically possible. The repository of our collective experience, words and the combination of words, our vocabulary is the data bank of our culture, and it is the structure of our language that governs the structure of our ideas. So he's very clearly committed to understanding a different way of looking at pictures and picture making rather than experiencing something kind of in the real world as Edward Weston, for instance, did. His great passion, besides presenting his work and the work of his friends at these alternative spaces in San Francisco, was writing books. And this is his second book, Structuralism and Photography. And I just want to go over rather quickly some of the images in this, because I think it will show you what where his interests lie. We're talking about, in this case, for instance, black and white photography and the fact that photographs are made out of negatives and made into positives from negatives. I think what's wonderful about this work is that after you see the idea explicated, it becomes kind of fanciful. And I think that the reliance on structure is a kind of interesting and communicable way for him to begin these quite richly and sometimes funny and sometimes really imaginative examinations of the way he can make photographs. So this I think is a particularly wonderful one because, for those of you who know, where this is taken. This is at the Legion of Honor in the parking lot. He's simply looking around and photographing around that fountain in the center, and then he sees, if you can read the text, he sees that it's incomplete and less interesting than he wanted it to be, so he includes his own position as it's changing with the light and his relationship to the object. I think what's so interesting to me is that though the work can be constraining, or the intent can be constraining, it's actually wonderfully imaginative and often humane and funny. So the restrictions which he finds necessary are really a kind of basic structure for him, like poetic conventions, to enlarge his vision within these funny limitations. I think probably the most interesting of all his works is the one that's actually on view now, where he looked at a corner of his room, his house, and photographed it over time as he saw the light changing on the floor. It seems like a very basic, but also poetic way of conveying in photography a kind of cinematic understanding of time, making it meditative, making it very similar to the painting conventions of the time, to minimalism, and just to make it very reflective in a very abstract way of how he understands the conventions of structuralism. Let me just show you a couple other pictures. This is a wonderful examination of things that are familiar to us, a vacuum cleaner and a light, and then finally to also tell you that another very important aspect of his work was doing exhibitions and books on the subject of language. For him, photography was a kind of new language. It was not formalist, but it was structuralist, and he was particularly interested in not only video art, this is a video project, but also what was going on here locally. This is the work of John Gutmann, who was a good friend, who was a kind of mutual supporter of his, and whose work was about actually language which he had to learn, being an immigrant from Germany during the war. And then finally, this work, which is also about language and also structuralist, by a local photographer, Victor Landweber, whose work is in the Berkeley Art Museum collection as well. Okay.
Hello, Brett Goodroad, here to talk about Fred Martin. I'm afraid of this thing. How's this work? Is that better? All right. Okay. Fred Martin, in an essay describing his 10-year tenure as director of the San Francisco Art Institute, wrote, "In June 1975, I left to focus on nothing but my art, as if I were some kind of manufacturer hunkering down on a core business." Further in the essay, he writes how, in the old days, there was the idea of the wheel of fortune, that whoever was on top now would later be on the bottom. In 1973, I had a major retrospective at the SF MoMA, but by the time my show took place, the directorship of the museum had changed, and mine was not the direction the new director planned to go. And no magazine put me on its cover, and no gallery rushed to sell my work. My career as an artist was on the downside of the wheel. Life hurts, art bleeds. In 2003, I applied to SFAI and was rejected by the grad program. I said I could move to SF and take some classes and try again. So I did, leaving a job on a buffalo ranch, tiring of what I've come to remember as the frozen fist of a fence builder. The first teacher I showed my work to was Fred. I had a sheet of slides and a one-sentence statement reading, "My painting is searching for the ultimate poetry of content." I showed him the half-figural work of those days, and from then, the encouragement was always the same, that our processes needed to exist, and that this practice is about living. When we were at coffee this last Thursday, we talked about his wife's poetry, how he spends his time collating some 900 pages of poems in his study, and how, if it were up to her, she'd publish all the poems in one single line instead of one per page. On that same afternoon, he told me about being propositioned in an elevator in China, and how on Mao's day that would have never happened, which then led to the glorious image of Fred covered in gold confetti at the opening of No Room for Form in the Shandong Art Museum in Jinan, China, in January last year. A salvo that sounded more like the beginning of the Rose Parade with Fred at the helm. And with another painter from SFAI, Jeremy Morgan, along with Ming Ren and David Fraser, they must have seemed unbelieving that an opening to a show of their work could cause such a fuss. But I think each of them must carry the image with them. The irony can't be lost in a world where, many times, others are maintaining the gates and mechanisms, for when would such a surreal praise happen again? You guys see that all right? It's a little darkened from my point of view there. I remember him calling when I was on harvest in Oklahoma. It was 114 degrees, 90% humidity. He was on summer in Montreal. It was 90 degrees, but no less humid. I told him about a love of mine and how unrequited it was, and he complained about the tasks of the day and how much the tasks were taking. Our conversations have never been long on the phone, and I always feel that he doesn't like the phone, but we keep in touch. A friend of mine once said that artists don't have colleagues, they have friends. Let's sit with this one for a second. We sit with variables, handle them. Already unstable, a practice about unknowing seems a bad idea. But we see it together, and I've learned so much through him. How much it means to be an artist, and the privilege it is to live the life as one. How it should be treated with open eyes, courage, and with an infusion of love. A love containing more than touch. It is a type of construction about which the broader mysteries of the intuition are addressed, and in Fred, as a world of bleeding edges. His language can orchestrate an immediate intimacy. In A Christmas Present of 2010, hovering below a blue star, not the now, but the always, rock of human experience, not the new, but the forever. And in below, in what the hand has made, the soul's touch lasts forever. And another received in October of 2011, begged for a star shining in the flesh to show the way. From an Antique Land, published in 2008, arriving that fall. I should note, he did tons of, I might not have not explicated as much, but he did so much mail art, just an amazing amount. From his Antique Land, published in 2008, arriving that fall, 2 conch shells were pressed open ends together inside my skull. Between them hung and flowed a continual swirl of mist. Then the shells became one and turned and opened to the sky out of the top of the back of my head. I saw a tree of tremendous height, the dark brown vertical trunk and a few branches, but mostly only the multitude blazing yellow leaves veined with red in autumn, reaching far below to tower out of sight above. I knew the tree feeds me, and I saw the red berries I eat, and I saw also the great tree as a white bush, and the berries are black. So much mail from Fred, so much painting, so much poetry. He is always at work, always melding edges and conjuring. I think some might call them evocations, but I like the idea of an artist as a magician, a man about legerdemain, about his hands spinning out, practicing, honing color as music, honing the textures by which painting interacts with you, how it is a painting foremost and not an image. David Park told him that there are pictures and there are paintings. So making it move outward, each color and atmosphere of itself, each piece acting on you, working toward dragging you, rushing you in, is primal in Fred. How this happens in Fred's work can be astoundingly simple. The gestural spin weighted by a single drop of red or black is about incredible sensitivity and the managing of the volcanic. It is also about being at work every day. I am reminded of his fist when I think of this rushing in of a composition. He shook it in my face in that first drawing class. I remember his teeth grinding as he pointed to my work, that if the internal, this fire, his natural expression, did not exist bodily in the work, then the work needed to seek it, saying, what is the point of all this if the work isn't about this? He asked me then about the 2,400 head of buffalo I ranged through the Gallatin Valley in Montana, and asked me where it was in my work. He asked me, where is that intensity, that vibration, the smell of shit, the shit in the air, the hooves stamping the earth, the bull's sex, the presence of my life in that air, the stars, their life in the midst of my own, the planets. Where is the singular vitality?
My name is Terry Cannon, and I've been asked to speak about Sara Kathryn Arledge, who is represented in the Waybay exhibition through about 20 or 25 of her glass slide Transparencies. And Sara would have been honored and delighted to be part of this exhibit. It's really quite special, so thank you for including her. I became aware of Sara Kathryn Arledge's artworks in 1976. As the founder and director of Pasadena Film Forum, I was contacted by filmmaker and historian Bill Moritz, who was teaching at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. Bill mentioned that an experimental film pioneer named Sara Kathryn Arledge was living in Pasadena, and that I might wish to contact her and view her films. It turned out that Arledge lived about a mile away, and we met at her home for a film screening and became good friends from the outset. What Bill did not tell me, as he probably did not know, was that Arledge not only made films, but she was also an accomplished painter and maker of what she called glass slide transparencies. Over the next 10 years, not only did we regularly exhibit Arledge's films and artworks in conjunction with Film Forum, but we were able to share in the first real public and critical acceptance of her artistry. By the 1990s, when she was in an extended care facility and suffering from dementia, my wife Mary and I were able to set up a trust to preserve Arledge's work for future generations. For the purposes of this talk, I'd like to share a few general historical insights into Arledge and her work, and to conclude with a screening of her film Interior Garden 2. Born in Mojave, California in 1911, Arledge spent her formative years in Pasadena, where she exhibited an early interest in art through drawing. In 1928, at the age of 17, she attended a performance of Thomas Wilfred's light organ at the Pasadena Playhouse. Wilfred called his light organ the Clavilux. It was a keyboard connected to different gels, which allowed colored and abstract light patterns to be projected onto a theater screen in front of an audience. Arledge found the effects to be mesmerizing, and it would influence her films, paintings, and glass slide transparencies in the years to come. Arledge's first major film, and the work which cemented her reputation as a pioneer of experimental cinema, was entitled Introspection. It consisted of a series of loosely connected technical and aesthetic experiments to film dance movement in order, in the words of Arledge, to add time to painting. The film was shot over the course of several years and was premiered in 1947 as part of Frank Stauffacher's Art and Cinema series at the San Francisco Museum of Art. The film was well received, and just as importantly for Arledge, she found in the Bay Area a respect and interest in experimental art forms that she had not experienced in the Pasadena area. In her writing, she indicated that even the shoe salesmen in San Francisco were interested in art. She recalled a drugstore clerk asking what she did for a living. When she replied that she made experimental films, the clerk said, "You make experimental films? How wonderful." Around this time, Arledge moved to the Bay Area, and while teaching at the College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland between 1947 and 1950, she began working in an entirely new medium which she called glass slide transparencies. She purchased 3¼ by 4-inch glass slides that were sold for documenting scientific specimens and utilized them as glass canvases. She began by taking the multicolored stage light gelatins that were left over from the making of Introspection, cutting them into small pieces, layering them on the glass surface, and then baking the glass in her kitchen oven. Once the gels had melted, she would create abstract images by drawing on the surface with a variety of objects, including toothpicks, Q-tips, crumpled napkins, toilet paper, and Sharpie pens. When satisfied with the results and the painting had dried, she would place another glass slide on top, then affix the 4 sides with tape, making in essence a glass sandwich. The transparency was then ready to insert into a lantern slide projector designed to enlarge the image onto a movie screen of this size. Capturing some of the excitement of the early magic lanterns, Arledge's slides, when illuminated, had an extraordinary 3-dimensional quality and produced an undulating, sparkling effect as the light source traveled through the layers of gels sandwiched in the glass. And the exhibit here at Waybay has about 20 or 25 of the slides made during that time period. In 1950, Arledge ceased working on her glass slides, and for the next 25 years, she focused exclusively on her films and oil and watercolor paintings. In the 1950s, while working on her second major film, What is a Man?, she suffered from schizophrenia and was institutionalized at the Napa State Mental Hospital, where she underwent electroshock therapy, which was commonly administered to patients suffering from a variety of mental illnesses. Now we'll flash forward to 1976, when my wife Mary and I became acquainted with Arledge. She had moved back to her family home in Pasadena that she had inherited from her parents. By now, she had returned to the medium that she had invented a quarter century earlier, the glass slide Transparencies. When we visited Arledge between 1976 and the early 1980s, we often found her working on her miniature glass canvases. With her eyesight failing, she had rigged a magnifying device connected to a lamp to both illuminate and make visible the glass surface. The work she produced during this time period was stunning and quite different from what she had done in the Bay Area in the post-war years. For the new slides, rather than using colored gels, she utilized India ink and soot from candles and matches, drawn and scratched onto the glass with pens, toothpicks, Q-tips, and the like. The resulting slides were again largely abstract, many of them resembling black and white and sepia-tone constellations and nightscapes. By now, Arledge had realized the inherently fragile nature of her glass slides and the difficulty in projecting them in public venues. To address this issue, she produced several 16mm films, which she called stable color films, that documented the slides and included a variety of sounds from nature, including rainfall and crickets, to accompany the images. Made between 1978 and 1980, these films were exquisite in their own right, although the inherent flatness of the movie image did not effectively reproduce the three-dimensional quality of the slides as originally projected. As a new generation of experimental film enthusiasts embraced Arledge's film work in the 1970s and 80s, she moved to Santa Cruz in the mid-1980s and remained there until her death in 1998. During this time, she lived in a number of extended care facilities, and it was clear to Mary and I that as Arledge began to struggle with dementia, her artwork was in jeopardy. Near the end of her life, her affairs were being managed by a state-appointed conservator, and all of her personal belongings, including film prints, glass slide transparencies, and paintings, were placed in a storage unit in Santa Cruz. We began the process of setting up a legal trust to preserve Arledge's work and to ultimately gain access to the storage unit containing her belongings. Unbeknownst to us, Arledge's meager savings were paying for the storage unit, and when those funds expired, the conservator planned to dispose of the contents of the storage unit to a junk dealer. Just days before the junk dealer was to be given access to the storage unit, the conservator found a check that had been sent to Arledge as partial payment for a property she had sold years earlier. These funds allowed the conservator to continue paying rent on the storage unit. Literally just days away from winding up in a landfill, Arledge's lifetime body of work had been reprieved. Mary and I were successful in setting up the trust, ultimately accessing the storage unit in 1995, and beginning the process of preserving and ultimately sharing Arledge's artwork for future generations, an effort which continues to this day. And of course, we thank the Pacific Film Archive and Berkeley Art Museum for providing a home to her films, her slides, and her writings. And we'll take a look at one of her films based on her slides, Interior Garden 2.
Okay, bringing up the rear here. So I'm here to talk about Frank Moore. Sorry. So I'm here to talk about Frank Moore. He has he has one piece in the current Way show. This is it, Patti Smith from 1979. It's one of two paintings that his estate recently gifted to the museum. The other one is Moira. It's from 1977. And I am operating on the assumption that most people who come to the show, or all of you, are unfamiliar with Frank Moore, so I'll just give a little bit of his biography. So Frank Moore was born in 1946 and he died in 2013, so, at the age of 67. He was born in Ohio, but he lived most of his life in California, and the last 4 or so decades he lived in Berkeley, which is where he was the most active, and where he made the work that most people are familiar with from him. So Frank was born with cerebral palsy. When he was born, his mother was told to not bring him home and to send him to an institution because there was no hope, and that she shouldn't bring a child home. It would be too much for her to care for. But in her autobiography, she says that she saw a light in his eyes, and it was from that light that told her not to do that and to bring him home and raise him along with his older brother. So here's Frank in middle school, and he has shortly after his mother created this pointer with a headband on his head so that he could communicate. Before that, they thought he was deaf, and so once they started to do that, he began to type, he began to paint, he began to write. And he also had letter boards that he would put on his wheelchair that he communicated with people. One thing that I think is significant about Frank and this letter board is that his letter board was faced, this is one of his final letter boards. His letter board faced outward to the person he stood across from because he very much wanted to communicate with somebody face to face. So the person standing would be standing oriented to the letterboard much like you are so that they could read as Frank pointed out and communicated with someone. Here Frank is painting another one of his paintings. And Frank was much more than a painter. In fact, it's interesting and odd that he is represented in the show with a painting because he's probably more well known for other mediums in which he worked. So this is the site index to his website called aeroplay.com, and I put that up there to just show you how prolific he was. He was a teacher, he did performances, long durational pieces, he was a writer, he was a poet, and he developed a very interesting curriculum that he worked together with students. So when I came to the show, I think I came on the first day that this iteration was here, and I looked for Frank's painting, and I walked around the corner and I saw it here, and it was great to see it next to, that's Paula Anglum, next to him, he's above Kota Azawa and O.J. Simpson, and he's right around the corner from Barry McGee, and it was really interesting for me to see him here in this white gallery in a museum context, because I'm used to seeing his paintings in his North Berkeley home, what used to be his North Berkeley home. And it's a very sort of joyously crowded, colorful space. So here's Patti Smith down at the bottom in his bedroom, and up here is his studio where he worked with students and developed his performances. And there's one of the other painting, Moira, in that. Another thing that struck me when I saw his piece here is how Patti Smith looked alone and isolated in this context. She was literally cut off from her surroundings and from other humans by the edge of the canvas. She's above everyone. And at first that struck me as, again, not being representative of Frank's work. But I started to think more about it as I looked, and I realized that that is very much about Frank. It did in many ways represent Frank and his work, because if there's one overarching theme to Frank's work, his vast body of work, it was about connection, and it was about human connection, connecting with other humans in a very deep, psychic, emotional, erotic, tactile, confrontational, joyous, and deep and profound way. And his early work, which is this painting is his early work, he really only painted in the first few decades of his sort of artistic life, particularly in oil paintings. His work was very much about isolation, and it showed figures in isolation. And it moved to making work that was about connection, making performances that involved dozens of people, lasted 24 to 48 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours. It was about connecting, it was about touching, it was visceral. And one of the ways that he tried to connect with people is here on the campus on the Berkeley campus. So here Frank is on Sproul Plaza in the late 70s and early 80s. And what he would do is he would roll up to Sproul Plaza by himself, and he would put a sign on the front of his wheelchair that said, "Talk to me." And as you can imagine, many, many people did not talk to him, but many people did. And one of the things that he would try to do is to connect with them, to talk to them, to ask them questions about themselves, some that were off-putting and a little strange for this person, a stranger, to be asking. And what he would invite them to a series and a workshop of a series of performances that he was doing at Berkeley. So it was not just students, it was everybody on Sproul Plaza. He would try to get them to come to these workshops / performances / spectacles / interventions. Here is one of them. It was called Active Dreams. This is a poster from this series, and I just want to read a little bit of what it says on one of the posters. Live art for daring people who like to be taken just outside the normal reality. Mr. Moore is known for his intimate performances, which are personal, sometimes intensely silly, sometimes softly sensual, sometimes loudly tacky, and almost always involving audience participation. And I'm just going to play a little excerpt from from this Active Dreams performance that was done here in Donnell Hall, right over there in Berkeley. This is just a little clip of it.
Rub each other's bare belly like a puppy's belly, soothingly. Hug and rock together.
Okay, just a little bit. So what you heard at the very end there, rock together. And from this series, he developed another sort of performance strategy, or a piece of his performance, which is called rapping and rocking. And that's what this is a photograph from one of those rapping and rocking performances. And what he did, again, this is about connection, is using very DIY materials, saran wrap and toilet paper. He connected himself to members of the audience, so that when Frank would spasm, when Frank would move, when another person in the audience would move, when the woman And it was almost always a woman would rock and with him on his wheelchair. Everybody would move. Everybody was connected. I'll just go ahead and play this. This is just a little bit of another rapping and rocking performance. Again, an excerpt to give you a sort of a sense of the tone and the...
Calmness. A girl laughs on the big old rocking horse. A ghost, blood oozing out, rocks on the battlefield, rocks to keep life in and pain out. Life pulses reflected of tin and plastic. Daddy rocking baby to sleep on his lap. Cozy togetherness in foils, rocking by the fire, far away from reality. Bare woman on her knees beside the unrecognizable remains of her husband, rocking to handle grief and pain. A crazy rocks on the street corner, talking to beings from another reality. Wrap us up cozy. Wrap us up warmly.
Okay. So I'll just want to conclude by reading a piece of writing that Frank wrote. It was one of the first pieces that I read from him. And it really landed with me and resonated with me and made me want to make a film about him. And I think it's interesting, this piece, which is from a longer performance that he did in 1985. It's just a little excerpt. I think it's interesting because it's about connection and the ways in which we do not connect with each other and the structures and the obstacles that keep us from connecting. And I also think it's an interesting piece to read here because I think it sort of critically informs how we talk about Frank and how we identify Frank and how we label Frank. So this is from the museum's text, and it says that Frank had cerebral palsy, he couldn't walk or talk. That is how I, in this very short presentation, decided to describe him. It was something I felt like you needed to know. It's what I say in my synopses and my grant applications. And I think it's something that Frank would really push back against. Sort of labeling him as a disabled artist or even an artist with a disability. I think it's something that he would really push against in his... He was a screecher. He would have screeched against it, and he would have confronted it, and he would have had he would have confronted it in a very sort of Frank Moore way. So this piece, again, is from a larger performance, and I'll just end with this. It's called Gestures Intro. We are in the cave of dream. We are in a battle of an underground war against fragmentation. Art is war against fragmentation. The battle is on all realities. The controllers have always tried to fragment us from each other, imprison us in islands of sex, color, religion, politics, classes, labels, etc., 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 etc. They fragment our inner worlds. They blow our individual realities apart and play the pieces against one another. They are us, or a part of us. They are the controllers, the politicians, the sexists, the women's libbers, the pornographers, the censors, the moralists, the church, the media, the businessmen, educators, the victims, and the powerful. They are us. They have divided us from our power, from our beauty, from our lust of life and pleasure. They have divided us from most of reality, dying from living, sex from living, sex from pleasure. We are kept in boxes of fear, of mistrust. We are kept waiting to do what we want, waiting for enough money, enough schooling, for everything to be right. We are kept waiting and protecting and hiding and suffering. Time to do battle with the boxes. Our tools are magic, our bodies, and dreams. Thank you.